Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Kenny McBride. The first official report into the circumstances of the Grenfell Tower fire, which killed 72 people in June of 2017, was published today. The findings are devastating. People died because the stay put policy was not lifted earlier, but the concept had become such an article of faith within the London Fire Brigade, so powerful that to depart from it was unthinkable. Sir Martin Moore-Bick, the Grenfell Inquiry's chair, remarked that the way the London Fire Brigade Commissioner Danny Cotton had rhetorically asked in her evidence, "It's all very well saying get everybody out, but then how do you get them all out?" demonstrated that the LFB had never itself sought an answer to that question. Faith in the idea that fires will not spread was part of the LFB's gravely inadequate preparation and planning. The performance of the LFB fell below the standards set by its own policies or national guidance, he concluded. Experienced commanders had no training in the dangers of combustible cladding. There was no contingency plan for the evacuation of Grenfell. The risk database for the building contained almost no information of any use, and the information it did contain dated from 2009, before the catastrophic refurbishment. The first incident commanders at Grenfell Tower were not properly prepared and failed to seize control of the situation or change strategy. None of them seem to have been able to conceive of the possibility of a general failure of compartmentalisation or a need for mass evacuation, Moore-Bick said. The shortcomings were systemic and both personnel and systems were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. But Michael Dowden, watch manager at North Kensington Fire Station, was among the junior staff criticised directly. He was first in charge on the scene and remained so until 1:50 a.m. and should have realised the fire had penetrated the building and that compartmentation, which underpins the stay put advice, had been breached. Dowden should have decided to evacuate the building, flooding the building with firefighters, knocking on doors to get people out. Fewer people would have died if the order to evacuate had been given by 2 a.m, said Moore-Bick. There were serious deficiencies in command and control, he said. Senior officers arriving later failed to give sufficient practical support or inform themselves quickly enough of conditions and operations within the building, and the best part of an hour was lost. Operators in the LFB control room in Stratford, East London, sometimes refused to believe desperate victims about smoke and fire, as they were overwhelmed by an unprecedented volume of emergency calls from Grenfell residents. Operators too often treated what callers were telling them with scepticism, in some cases contradicting the caller. Often they insisted the fire was on floor 4, contrary to what they were being told by the caller. They appear to have been unable to grasp the fact that it had spread rapidly up the building. Many wrongly told residents help was on its way, and the advice was based purely on their personal expectations and assumptions. That was very dangerous because the whole concept of fire survival guidance rests on a well-founded expectation that the caller will ultimately be rescued. There was poor communication between the control room and the fire, and no TV was turned on to show images of the fire. Many saved lives. A notable example is the courage and calm of Heidi Fox in coaxing Marcio Gomez and his family down from floor 21. While there was widespread failure to comply with regulations, Moore-Bick did not conclude that errors cost lives. Moore-Bick said that the rapid spread of the fire across Grenfell Tower remained profoundly shocking, and in one of his most significant findings ruled that the 2014-16 refurbishment of the tower breached building regulations. This will pile pressure on the companies involved in the works ahead of the inquiry's second phase. The main reason for the spread of the fire were the cladding panels, manufactured by Arconic, with polyethylene cores, which had high calorific value, melted and acted as a source of fuel for the growing fire. The design of the refurbishment, overseen by Studio E architects, as well as the insulation materials made by Celotex and Kingspan, also contributed, he said. The report made several recommendations, including a law requiring owners and managers of high-rise residential buildings to provide their local fire and rescue services with information about external wall materials and building plans. Fire brigade inspections of high-rise buildings are to be improved and crews trained to carry out more thorough risk evaluations. Regular inspection of lifts intended to be used by firefighters are needed. Communications between fire brigade control rooms where emergency calls are received and incident commanders must improve, and there must be a dedicated communication link. Government should develop national guidelines for carrying out partial or total evacuations of high-rise residential buildings. Fire doors in all multi-occupancy residential properties should be urgently inspected, and improvements should be made to the data links provided by helicopters of the National Police Air Service. Pictures transmitted on the night of Grenfell could not be viewed by the LFB because the encryption was incompatible with its receiving equipment. This report reflects the first phase of the public inquiry. The second phase will look into the circumstances surrounding the refurbishment of the tower, including the addition of that flammable cladding, which appears to have significantly contributed to the spread of the fire. Here in Glasgow, the pilot of a helicopter that crashed into the Clutha Bar in Glasgow, killing 10 people, including himself, decided to ignore low fuel warnings, an inquiry has found. The crash on the night of Friday 29th of November 2013 killed the pilot, Captain David Trail, 2 police officers and 7 customers in the bar. A further 31 people were injured. In his written determination following 5 months of oral evidence in a fatal accident inquiry, the Sheriff Principal Craig Turnbull said, Captain Trail consciously took a risk in proceeding on the basis that the low fuel warnings were in some way erroneous, when they were not. That decision had fatal consequences. Turnbull added, the central issue was why Captain Trail allowed the supply tanks to deplete to the point that they did, when there was more than sufficient usable fuel available to him in the main tank to allow the helicopter to return safely to base. He said it was clear from the evidence that the accident was caused by Trail's failure to ensure that at least one of the fuel transfer pump switches was set to on. The inquiry heard that the helicopter's engines flamed out sequentially as a result of fuel starvation while the craft was airborne. Turnbull found that there was enough time between the first and second engine flameouts for Trail to have switched on the fuel transfer pumps. He said he did not believe he could offer guidance to prevent further deaths occurring in similar circumstances, because the particular circumstances of this crash appear to be unique. He said, had Captain Trail performed the actions set out in the pilot's checklist, the accident would not have happened. Those killed included Trail himself, aged 51, PC Tony Collins, 43, PC Kirsty Nellis, 36, Gary Arthur, 48, Joe Cusker, 59, Colin Gibson, 33, Robert Jenkins, 61, John McGarrigle, 58, Samuel McGee, 56, and Mark O'Prey, 44. Witnesses told the inquiry that they heard a spluttering and grinding noise before the helicopter fell. The inquiry, roughly equivalent to an inquest, was charged with establishing what caused the fatal crash and how the victims died. It took place in a temporary court at Hampden Football Stadium to accommodate scores of witnesses, aviation experts and family members. Breaks in the hearings were scheduled to fit around football matches and concerts at the venue. An Air Accidents Investigation Branch report published in 2015 found 2 fuel supply switches were off and the pilot did not follow emergency procedures after a fuel warning in the cockpit. The Crown Office ruled there was not enough evidence to justify criminal proceedings. The police interviewed 2,000 witnesses and amassed 1,400 pieces of evidence for the fatal accident inquiry. Also in Glasgow, after 2 catastrophic fires, the Glasgow School of Art has announced the names of 5 new governors to shape the institution's future. Anne Faulds, the lawyer who a decade ago helped Donald Trump defeat opposition to his golf resort in Aberdeenshire, is perhaps the most eye-catching of the appointments in a group that includes experts in business development and academia. Nora Kearney, chairwoman of the Board of Governors, predicted that the 5 individuals would play a key role in shaping the future of the GSA, including supporting the appointment of a permanent director and, in due course, the rebuild of the Macintosh building. The announcement came ahead of today's Scottish parliamentary debate, brought forward by the Culture Committee, into the fires in 2014 and 2018 which destroyed the Category A listed Macintosh building, the centrepiece of the art school. Earlier this year, the committee recommended that if the MAC was to be rebuilt, an independent trust should oversee the reconstruction project and not the school's board. The timing of the announcement of the appointments of the governors appears to reflect the art school's determination to keep control of the project to rebuild its most famous asset. The new governors also include Kristen Benny, the head of Open Experience at RBS, an expert in business development, and John French, a fellow of Wolfson College, Cambridge, a specialist in entrepreneurship and enterprise, who is said to have a strong track record in capital projects, governance and oversight. Martin Herbert, a director with KPMG, and Sue Wu, a graduate of GSA and co-founder of the branding agency Pink Squid, have also joined the board. Professor Kearney said there had been more than 30 responses to a call for applicants earlier this year. The calibre of the applicants was excellent, reflecting the profile and reputation of the GSA as one of the world's top 10 creative education institutions, she said. It also demonstrates the level of commitment there is to building the position of the GSA. The lay governors will join the board next month and will serve initially for 3 years. Meanwhile, at Holyrood, MSPs debated the issues surrounding the fires at the School of Art. The debate was led by Joan McAlpin, convener of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee, following publication of their report, The Glasgow School of Art Mackintosh Building, The Loss of a National Treasure. The report calls for a full public inquiry with judicial powers to investigate the circumstances surrounding both the 2014 and 2018 fires, looking into the challenges of preventing fire in historically important buildings. There was cross-party support for such an inquiry. Conservative MSP Adam Tompkins suggested that the inquiry should be able to require that the building be taken out of the sole control of the School of Art. And while McAlpin refused to preempt the work of the inquiry, said that she agreed that it would be wise for private organisations not to have full control of important historical buildings like the MAC. Labour MSP Pauline McNeill and Green co-leader Patrick Harvey both highlighted long-standing tensions between the GSA and the surrounding community. Harvey said that local residents viewed the School of Art as a selfish neighbour. Both also expressed full support for the inquiry and a need to involve the community in plans for the future. In Brexit news, an assessment has been made by a think tank that under the free trade agreement envisaged in the deal, Scottish gross domestic product would be 6.1% lower by 2030 compared to forecasts under continued EU membership. This equates to around £1,600 per person. The potential for delays to trade and non-tariff barriers, such as country of origin rules and regulatory alignment, could leave Scotland's food and drink, digital and service sectors particularly vulnerable. By granting Northern Ireland continued access to the European single market, the deal puts Scottish companies at a competitive disadvantage, while it also fails to address an expected decline in the working age population caused by ending freedom of movement for people. Presenting the new assessment to the Scottish Parliament, Constitutional Relations Secretary Michael Russell said, "The paper we have published today sets out the impact of this disastrous deal on Scotland. It removes any pretense that the UK intends to seek a future relationship with the EU beyond a limited free trade agreement. The Fraser of Allender Institute estimates that Scotland's economy is already around 2% smaller, £3 billion, than it would have been without the vote to leave the EU. And let's be clear, this exit deal does not in any way get Brexit done. It would merely unleash fresh, ever more complex and ever more acrimonious disputes on the population. The likelihood is that it merely postpones a no-deal crash-out for a little over a year. The UK government has repeatedly failed to live up to its promises to fully involve the devolved administrations in the Brexit negotiations. The result is a bad deal which will damage Scotland's interest and ignores our democratic will. The people of Scotland have the right to determine their own future free from Brexit as an independent member of the European Union." Meanwhile, another think tank has said that Boris Johnson's Brexit deal would hurt Britain's economy more than further delays and continued uncertainty about leaving the European Union. Late last night, Johnson won support in Parliament for an election on the 12th of December that he hopes will break the Brexit deadlock and lead to the approval of the deal he clinched with Brussels earlier this month. Johnson has said this deal is the only solution to the uncertainty that has weighed on the economy since the 2016 referendum. By contrast, the Labour Party wants to negotiate a new deal and put it to a second referendum, which could overturn 2016's result, while the Liberal Democrats and the SNP seek to stop Brexit altogether. Johnson's Brexit plan opens the door to much looser economic ties between Britain and the EU. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research said that the economic gain of a more distant relationship would outweigh the gains from ending Brexit uncertainty. "We don't expect there to be a deal dividend at all," said economist Arno Hanche of NIESR. A deal would reduce the risk of a disorderly Brexit outcome, but eliminate the possibility of a closer economic relationship. Unlike Theresa May's deal, Johnson's deal does not require England, Scotland and Wales to stay in a customs union with the EU in future, making tariffs and other barriers likely after a transition period. The think tank estimated that in 10 years' time, Britain's economy would be 3.5% smaller under Johnson's plan than if it stayed in the EU, roughly equivalent to losing the entire economic output of Wales. In a scenario of ongoing uncertainty similar to now, where Britain keeps the economic benefits of unrestricted access to EU markets, but without any long-term guarantees, the economy would be only 2% smaller. May's deal would have limited the damage to 3%, while a no-deal Brexit would make the economy 5.6% smaller than if it stayed in the bloc. Earlier this month, another academic think tank, UK in a Changing Europe, estimated Johnson's deal would make Britain more than 6% poorer per head. In the nearer term, NIESR said the Bank of England should cut interest rates to 0.5% from 0.75% at a meeting next week, but said it did not expect the Bank of England to act until March, when Governor Mark Carney's successor is due to be in place. The Bank of England has been an outlier among major central banks in not loosening policy as the global economy slows. NIESR said inflation was likely to undershoot the BOE's target, especially if sterling rallied on the basis of a reduced risk of a no-deal Brexit. The think tank forecast Britain's economy would grow 1.4% this year and next, assuming no major short-term change to Britain's relationship with the EU, down from 1.6% in 2018 and well below its long-run average. Responding to that analysis, SNP economy spokesperson Kirsty Blackman MP said the SNP were the only party in Scotland that could beat the Tories, stop Brexit and protect Scotland's right to choose its own future as an independent country. Blackman said, Boris Johnson's extreme Tory Brexit would be devastating for Scotland, destroying jobs and dealing a body blow to living standards, public services and the economy, which would leave the whole country poorer and worse off. Scotland has been completely ignored by Westminster throughout the Brexit process, and we now face being dragged out of the EU against our will on the hardest terms, with Scotland singled out alone of UK nations for a raw deal that would take us out of the EU, single market and customs union, and leave us at a competitive disadvantage. The coming election will be one of the most important in Scotland's history. Only a vote for the SNP can beat the Tories, stop Brexit, and protect Scotland's right to choose our own future as an independent country. Ian Blackford MP also raised the issue at Prime Minister's Questions today. The SNP's Westminster leader said, "This election is one of the most important in Scotland's history. Boris Johnson's devastating plan to impose an extreme Tory Brexit would take a wrecking ball to Scotland's economy, destroying jobs and inflicting lasting harm on living standards and public services. Only a vote for the SNP can secure the escape route for Scotland away from this Brexit mess, the chaos of Westminster, the austerity of the Tories, and protect Scotland's right to choose our own future as an independent country in Europe." Also at Prime Minister's Questions today, in response to a question from John Lamont MP, Johnson raised renewed serious concerns about his respect for the devolution settlement, after suggesting that the Scottish Government could be stripped of its powers over the NHS if waiting times were not reduced further.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate my honourable friend on everything that he does for his constituency in Berwickshire. He's absolutely right. That it is, and that is why, as I said earlier, that is why they rant, to use his own word. That is why they rant so incessantly about independence, because they wish to distract, they wish to dead cat, as the saying goes, from the lamentable failures of the SNP government in Scotland. And he's entirely right. If this goes on, I think that the SNP will forfeit all right to manage the NHS in Scotland.
SNP Deputy Leader Keith Brown also commented on the forthcoming election, saying, "This upcoming election will be one of the most important in living memory. Scotland didn't vote for Brexit, but the Tories at Westminster are hell-bent on dragging Scotland out of the EU against our will. Today's analysis has made clear that any form of Brexit will inflict major harm on Scotland's economy, costing hard-working families across the country £1,600 per person. We can't let Boris Johnson cut us off from the world, putting thousands of jobs at stake in the process. It's time for action, not words. Let's use this election to send Westminster a message that we've had enough of this Brexit chaos. The SNP is by some distance the strongest pro-European party in the UK, with 100 parliamentarians in Holyrood, Westminster and Brussels ready to stand up for Scotland and take serious action to stop Brexit. A vote for the SNP on the 12th of December is a vote to assert Scotland's right to choose a brighter future with independence. Meanwhile, in his response to a ministerial statement on the new EU exit deal, Scottish Green co-leader Patrick Harvie raised the downgrading of commitments to provide a level playing field with Europe in Johnson's deal with the EU. Speaking afterwards, Patrick Harvie said, Liz Truss, the Trade Secretary, said that scrapping these protections is vital to giving the Tories the freedom and flexibility to strike new trade deals. On the same day, an unnamed cabinet source said the level playing field policy has to go because it would seriously restrict our ability to deregulate. If that withdrawal bill is put forward after this general election, we face the very real threat that the Scottish Parliament may be unable to protect Scotland from this kind of hard-right extremist ideology. That's why it's vital for Scotland to have the right to choose our own future so we can start to build a progressive, sustainable, independent Scotland in Europe. The Scottish Greens led efforts not only to oppose Brexit, but also to regulate big business and bring about Scotland's fairer tax system. Our Green New Deal offers a radical progressive vision, and that's why a vote for the Scottish Greens in December is the clearest way to demand action. SNP MP Drew Hendry has warned that the Tories' hostile environment is continuing to tear families apart after raising a constituent case at PMQs that could see a mother separated from her 2 young children over Christmas due to inhumane and draconian Home Office processes. The MP brought the Prime Minister's attention to the case of his constituent Rachel, who submitted her spousal visa application papers which met the checklist requirements. She then followed up with the UK government's Visas and Immigration Agency to ensure the paperwork was in order so that she can be reunited with her family. However, the visa application was refused. Rachel, who is a Malaysian citizen and has been living with her husband Mark and their 2 children in Aviemore on a visitor visa, has been told to return to Malaysia to pay another £2,000 and submit the documents again for a spousal visa, so she can continue to live in Scotland with her family. However, she now faces the prospect of being away from her family over the Christmas period. Commenting on the case, Drew Hendry MP said, "The Tories' hostile environment has for far too long kept families apart, separated parents from their young children, and hit the pockets of families who face having to pay thousands of pounds to navigate draconian and inhumane Home Office processes. My constituent has been separated from her husband and 2 young children after her spousal visa application was rejected, despite providing all the information requested on the UK VI checklist. Not only did she have to pay £2,000 for the initial application, she has now had to fork out the cost once again for another application, and her 2 young children face a Christmas period without their mother. That is simply unacceptable. At this general election, only a vote for the SNP can secure the escape route for Scotland away from the UK government's inflexible and toxic immigration policies. Scotland's interests have been ignored by Westminster, and this election is Scotland's chance to reject the Tories' hostile environment and reject immigration policies that have torn families apart. Westminster is broken, and a decade of devastating Tory policies are harming our economic and social needs. It's time to take Scotland's future into Scotland's hands." In London, Facebook has agreed to pay a £500,000 fine, the highest possible, to the Information Commissioner's Office over the Cambridge Analytica scandal, ending more than a year of litigation between the regulator and the social network. The ICO announced its intention to fine Facebook in July 2018. Unusually, the office went public with its intention before giving Facebook a chance to respond, and ultimately issued the official penalty notice 3 months later in October. Facebook appealed against the fine, and in June 2019 the tribunal issued an interim decision holding that procedural fairness and allegations of bias on the part of the ICO should be considered as part of the appeal, and that the ICO should be required to disclose materials relating to its decision-making process. Under the terms of the settlement, Facebook has made no admission of liability. The company has also been allowed to retain the documents disclosed by the ICO, in part because they may help in its own investigation into the issues around Cambridge Analytica. That investigation had been paused at the ICO's request. Since Cambridge Analytica's data protection violations occurred in 2015, before the implementation of the EU's General Data Protection Regulation in 2018, the maximum possible fine the ICO could level was £500,000. If the offences had occurred after May 2018, the potential fine could have been much higher, up to 4% of Facebook's annual turnover. James Dipple-Johnston, the ICO's Deputy Commissioner, said, "The ICO welcomes the agreement reached with Facebook for the withdrawal of their appeal against our monetary penalty notice and an agreement to pay the fine. The ICO's main concern was that UK citizen data was exposed to a serious risk of harm. Protection of personal information and personal privacy is of fundamental importance, not only for the rights of individuals, but also, as we know now, for the preservation of a strong democracy. We are pleased to hear that Facebook has taken and will continue to take significant steps to comply with the fundamental principles of data protection. With this strong commitment to protecting people's personal information and privacy, we expect that Facebook will be able to move forward and learn from the events of this case." Harry Kinmonth, a lawyer representing Facebook, said, "We are pleased to have reached a settlement with the ICO. As we have said before, we wish we had done more to investigate claims about Cambridge Analytica in 2015. We made major changes to our platform back then, significantly restricting the information which app developers could access. Protecting people's information and privacy is a top priority for Facebook, and we are continuing to build new controls to help people protect and manage their information." The ICO has stated that it has not discovered evidence that the data of Facebook users in the EU was transferred to Cambridge Analytica by Dr. Alexander Kogan. However, we look forward to continuing to cooperate with the ICO's wider and ongoing investigation into the use of data analytics for political purposes. In Turkey, Turkish leaders have condemned a decision by the US House of Representatives to recognise the mass killings of Armenians by the Ottoman Empire as genocide, saying today that it would damage the critical relationship between NATO allies. Armenia praised the vote yesterday, which Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan hailed on Twitter as a bold step towards serving truth and historical justice. But in Turkey, government ministers and officials said the timing of the vote, after weeks of international criticism of Ankara's military incursion against Syrian Kurdish forces, showed that it was politically motivated. The Foreign Ministry said US Ambassador David Satterfield had been summoned today. President Tayyip Erdogan, who is due to meet US President Donald Trump at the White House in 2 weeks, said he had not decided yet whether the trip was going ahead. Asked whether he would make the visit after recent developments, Erdogan said the issue remained a question mark. Speaking to legislators from his AK party, Erdogan said the legislation won support because of the fallout in the United States over Ankara's operation in northeast Syria against the Kurdish YPG militia, which was the main US partner in the battle against Islamic State in Syria. These efforts were passed by the House of Representatives using a negative air that has formed against our country among the American public, Erdogan said. In a sense, they were being opportunistic. Erdogan said an Armenian militant group killed more than 40 diplomats in attacks on Turkish missions in 21 countries in the 1970s and 1980s. "We reject unilateral judgments on events more than a century ago that don't even mention Turkey's losses," he said. Erdogan's communications director called Tuesday's vote deeply troubling. "Those who voted for this resolution will be responsible for the deterioration of a critical strategic relationship in a turbulent region," Fahrettin Altun said. Altun repeated a call by Erdogan to form a historical commission to investigate the events. Turkey accepts that many Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire were killed in clashes with Ottoman forces during World War I, but contests the figures and denies that the killings were systematically orchestrated or that they constitute a genocide. The House of Representatives also backed legislation calling on President Donald Trump to impose sanctions on Turkey over its offensive in northern Syria. Ankara had reached separate agreements with Moscow and Washington to remove YPG fighters from its border. The agreement has led to Trump lifting sanctions on Ankara. Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu said the two resolutions were passed because Turkey had thwarted the game in Syria by reaching agreements with Russia and the United States. They are trying to avenge this. There is no other explanation, he told reporters. Turkey's parliament also condemned the US resolutions. In a statement, Parliamentary Speaker Mustafa Şentop said the move was the last straw and that it fueled enmity between the allies rather than contribute to friendship. Ties between Washington and Ankara have been under pressure over issues including Ankara's purchase of Russian S-400 missile systems and Washington's refusal to extradite Fethullah Gulen, whom Ankara blamed for a failed 2016 military coup. Back in Scotland, the second and final part of a review into compliance of all building systems at the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and Department of Clinical Neurosciences has been published. Concluding work ordered by Health Secretary Jeane Freeman in July, the latest NHS National Services Scotland report focuses on fire systems, electrical systems and medical gases. This has identified remedial work required within fire and electrical systems prior to occupation and opportunities for other improvements. The first part of the NSS review, which was published last month, outlined issues with ventilation and water systems which also need to be resolved. NHS Lothian has published a response setting out a programme of activity to address the findings in the latest report, following an assessment of the work to be completed. A wider action plan bringing together both reports will follow in due course. Last month, the Health Secretary announced a timeline for the phased move of services to the new hospital. The DCN is expected to move in spring 2020, with the rest of the hospital migrating to the new site in autumn of next year. Ms Freeman said, "The safety and well-being of all patients and their families has always been and will remain top priority, and I am truly sorry for any impact the current situation has had on them. I've written to staff again today to keep them informed of the latest developments and to express my continuing gratitude for their dedication and professionalism. Over the past few months, they have continued to provide high-quality clinical services and care in what have been very difficult and disappointing circumstances." This second report from NSS has identified remedial and improvement work required within the fire and electrical systems, and that will be factored into a wider plan of work being taken forward to ensure safety at the site. As I set out in Parliament last month, I expect the DCN to move in spring 2020, with the rest of the Children's Hospital migrating to the new site in autumn next year. Scottish Green MSP Alison Johnson said, "It's absolutely disgraceful that a brand new hospital is in such a state of disrepair before it has even seen a patient. This entire debacle has let down families who expected their children to be treated in a state-of-the-art facility and let down hard-working staff. The Scottish Government is shelling out millions of pounds every month due to its dodgy and discredited private finance initiative and delivering absolutely nothing in return. The Health Secretary must update Parliament on this ongoing shambles as a matter of urgency." Economic statistics now, and GDP is estimated to have fallen by 2.2% during the second quarter of 2019, according to statistics announced today by the Chief Statistician. The fall in output has been revised up from the first estimate of 0.3% published on the 18th of September because of stronger growth in the services sector. During the second quarter, the revised figures show that output in the construction sector fell by 2.4%, output in the production sector fell by 1.5%, and output in the services sector grew by 0.2%. As reported in the first estimate, two subsectors of manufacturing, food and drink, and pharmaceutical and related industries account for most of the contraction this quarter. Output in these industries fell back after a very strong performance in the first quarter. When compared to the second quarter of 2018, growth over the year is now estimated at 0.6%. This has been revised down from the first estimate of 0.7% because growth in the previous two quarters has been revised down slightly. The GDP quarterly national accounts publication includes the second estimate of growth for the April to June period. This uses data which has been released since the first estimate was published. The quarterly national accounts also include a range of other statistics which are used for economic analysis, forecasting and modelling. Meanwhile, the chief statistician has also released statistics showing that the amount of retail goods bought in Scotland grew by 0.4% during July to September 2019. Over the same period, Great Britain as a whole saw 0.6% growth. The amount spent on retail sales, not adjusted for inflation, grew by 1.1% during July to September 2019. Over the same period, Great Britain as a whole saw 1% growth. And that is all the news for tonight. We thank you very much for joining us. And we would just remind you, as we always do, that making TV programs like this is an expensive business. We have a lot of things we want to do and a lot of things that we are ready and willing and able to do if we have the resources to make them happen. That includes things like all-night election coverage in come December and coverage of everything really that we could. We want to be a full news, provide a full news service, as well as providing a full range of other kinds of programming as well. We can only do that with your support. So do please, if you can afford it, go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register to become a supporter. Your £5 a month will make all the difference. And then on that note, we just want to thank you for joining us, and we will be back at the same time tomorrow night with Gordon hosting. Until then, I've been Kenny McBride. Thank you and good night.